We'll just start with the beginning. What do you remember about the founding of Friends of the Caw?
Okay, from the very beginning.
In the beginning.
In the beginning, um, I've told you this story briefly. I had just arrived in Kansas in 1991, and I was teaching in systematics and ecology at the University of Kansas. And one of my colleagues was Frank Cross. And Frank was just a fabulous, fabulous man. He had retired, but he had been the head of the Biological Survey, and at one point at least the head of the Natural History Museum. So he was someone who really developed the programs at KU, and he was an ichthyologist, an excellent ichthyologist. He wrote the Fish Guide for Kansas, and there's now co-authors, but it's still substantially his work. He knew every stream in Kansas. And at the time, I don't know how old he was. He must have been at least 70. So he must have been born in the 1920s, somewhere around the Oklahoma Panhandle or southern Kansas. As he told me all these fabulous stories, terrible sometimes, because he grew up during the Dust Bowl and everything else, but these amazing stories about the Kansas River over time, and about the streams in Kansas. And I was quite young at the time, and he just thought it was the cutest thing on earth that one of his replacements was this girl. And so he just had a grand time taking me all over Kansas and introducing me to people. And we just had so much fun. We'd go out to these farms, and there's these old farmers in overalls would come out, and they just adored him. They'd say, "Frank!" And they'd come out, and he would pull out a seine, and they would jump in boots and overalls and all in the stream. These Kansas, like in western Kansas, and just seine the streams with him. And then he would carefully teach them all the minnows, and everybody just adored Frank. So one day Frank said, "I've got some people you have to meet." And he took me over to one of the stone houses that Lance and Patty were restoring. The ones in North Lawrence along the river. Mm-hmm. And they're just amazing, these old houses. Anyway, so we sat at the picnic table, and they started talking about this wildlife preserve that they would walk their dogs in. And it was a place that was really important to them. Just so happened to be on the inside of the levees, on top of one of the old dumps. Mm-hmm. And so the dump had been capped and had turned into this park, and they really loved this park. But the problem was that they were going to dredge next to it. And they didn't like the dredges there. So the four of us sat around, we had this long talk about, well, what are the dredges going to do? I mean, it was really typical for people back before all the environmental laws that tell you where to put a landfill. It was really very typical for people to put the town landfill next to a river.
Upstream.
It's just really upstream from the water source. A really bad place to have a dump. But they had stabilized it, and it was there. So we started talking, and I don't know in detail the actions that Lance took, but one of the things that we were bouncing around talking about is you don't want to destabilize the river next to an old open dump, and we had no idea what's in it. Oh. In those old dumps, if they're 100 years old, you have no idea what's in there. And so, that was one of the things that they were going to pull into the entire fight against dredging. But from what I understood at the time, they were very passionate about keeping the dredges away from those beautiful areas along the river, the wildlife areas, and things of that sort. So that kind of blossomed into a realization that at the time, I think there were only 3 public accesses in 170 miles. So nobody really went on the river. And, at the time, the older people had grown up with the river before the reservoirs, before the levees. So it was this wild, rampaging river that regularly flooded Topeka and flooded towns and everything else. So there was kind of an attitude that people were both afraid of the river and saw the river as this monster that would attack them. This kind of in the back of people's minds. You could kind of hear that when you'd like I showed up as
Stay away from the river.
I know I was with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service before I came here as a research fisheries biologist. I love rivers. I was doing crazy things on like the Buffalo River down in Arkansas, just insane things during high water and everything else. So yeah, I loved rivers, and I was a little bit young and insane, and I love this river.
You thought it's not so wild.
No, and people would look at me like that river, took my grandmother's house.
It's got quicksand.
It's got quicksand. It's got quicksand. It's going to eat you and everything else. So there was this very adversarial feel for the river that made it very difficult to get people to want to go on it. And that was one of the brilliant things about how Friends of the Caw took off was they just did these civil disobedience guerrilla actions where everybody would, they have like all these people on the river and inner tubes and everything else, anything they could float with, they'd have these giant float trips. It was really
I was on
crazy.
one of those.
It was really crazy. Yeah, to try to publicize the fact that the river was there. So those are my earliest memories of what probably came together in some kind of a stew that launched it. I wasn't involved in the organization itself, but from what I was watching, that was kind of the atmosphere that was sort of gelling. One of the things I was attracted to about Kansas, and I mean this respectfully, was when I was a graduate student out in California. Literally, if you weren't a billionaire or a movie star or, had something huge behind you, you weren't going to be able to do much. Any environmental action that we took in the late 70s and early 80s would have these giant repercussions. You tried to protect a little beach and you'd have Pacific Gas and Electric coming after you. Literally, our marine lab, they bought up all the land around our marine lab so we couldn't build anything in retaliation for our environmental impact statements. And so as one person, you really couldn't do much unless you were well-connected or wealthy or something like that. But when I came to Kansas, I realized that this was kind of a human-sized place where you could actually go speak to your governor and people could talk, and you could have some impact, and that's kind of what I saw happening with the Friends of the Cause. They were so much more empowered.
Truly grassroots.
Truly grassroots, thinking that they could actually do something.
Yeah.
Which
what gall.
Thank
goodness.
Compared to the billionaires out in California, yeah.
Was it a public river then?
Well, it's always been since the founding of the state. So what's a public river is something that's set up pretty much in state constitutions. And so navigable rivers are public rivers. Now we can argue.
Navigable by what? That's always the question, right?
But they did have paddle wheels going.
I know. Like 24 or so.
But we are going to call it a navigable river.
Yeah.
We are going to hold on to it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so it was the Ark, the Caw, and the Missouri.
Just that little piece of Missouri.
Yeah. And then the federal reservoirs, the land in pretty much the flood areas of the federal reservoirs are public. So
that's about it.
Yeah, it's pretty narrow here.
A couple dozen state parks but the river, thank goodness. What was your involvement in the beginning there? Or you said you didn't have much involvement?
I was a Fed, and I came here and became a university professor.
Okay.
So my involvement with a lot of the different groups that were forming back then was anyone who called me, anything they needed. I was a professor. I wanted to build capacity. I'd answer any questions. I'd sig a student on it for a thesis or whatever. So I always saw myself as someone who would donate time to whatever anybody needed. Because, again, there weren't, especially back then, there just were not a lot of
People didn't know.
People available. Just because, we didn't have, we had some excellent scientists, but we didn't have a lot of aquatic scientists, and so if we could boast a dozen really good aquatic scientists in the state of Kansas, that's pretty good for a state this size.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like the hundreds that you get on the coast.
Mm-hmm.
The same thing with most of the expertise. If you had the expertise, you might have been one of a handful. And so it was I felt it was our duty to, like, anybody who needs anything,
Mm-hmm.
because they're not going to have, I tease sometimes when I go on either coast that they have an expert falling out of the trees everywhere you walk, because there's so many people, so many universities, experts. So many agencies, experts everywhere. It's like a forest of experts. And we have very good people, but we're a small state.
Yes.
So I just donated a lot of time.
And in my memory, at least in my term as board, you were like our science consultant.
Well, until we grew up some more.
Yeah.
Yes. It's like,
thankfully.
But the EPA had lost the big lawsuit to the Sierra Club Legal Defense Fund, which is now Earth Justice. The Sierra Club Legal Defense and the Kansas Natural Resources Council had won a lawsuit against the EPA to force Kansas to start taking responsibility for enforcement of the Clean Water Act. Mm-hmm. It wasn't that unusual. We were late to the game, but so the Clean Water Act is a federal law, but it's delegated to the states, and the states enforce it. That meant that all of a sudden, KDHE had to really build out its capacity. We had our students surveying every stream and every watershed in the state of Kansas to figure out what the water quality standards should be. It took 20 years to roll it out. So we were putting out students as fast as we could. For every agency, for the Cattlemen's Association, for any stakeholder who needed a scientist, you were putting out bachelor's and master's students as fast as we possibly could to build capacity in the state to do that Clean Water Act work.
Wow.
So, 90s was just crazed activity.
And always a struggle.
But as a result of that, and then subsequently, you've got some fabulous people on your board now, some fabulous people doing your science work.
Well, that leads me to my next question. How have you seen the organization evolve? It started out with dredging, and that battle was won initially. But, or what's your interpretation of it?
Yeah, it started off with a deep desire to have some recreation.
Oh, that's true. We won a paddle.
The love of nature, in a place where there's not a lot of access for anything.
The passion is, yeah.
That's where the passion was. And dredging just got swept into that. Mm-hmm. I don't think that it was a matter of deep scientific understanding that dredging destabilizes. Mm-hmm. It wasn't that. It's like dredging was scary. Dredging was, changed the channels, endangered habitats, were hard to paddle past. Dredging, I think, was part of many different things at the time, where the river was seen as part of like an industrial system. Mm-hmm. It was where you put your effluent. We were at like the lowest possible level.
Every culture dumps in the river, right?
Mm-hmm. And it was smelly oftentimes. So it was that and the dredging and a whole bunch of things. So the river was like this industrial thing. It wasn't for recreation. It wasn't a place you went to enjoy yourself. People were scared of it. Mm-hmm. It started pretty low, and the Friends of the Call, have risen with generational change, change in mentality, a lot of different things, and Friends of the Call really helped a lot of that along locally. Mm-hmm. So
yeah, definitely the recreation has. Really, recreation's education. Yeah, equals education, right?
Yeah, and it's interesting that we also had the advent of cheap kayaks.
Yeah,
it's not that easy to canoe on that river.
No. We
No.
have our diehard canoeists,
yes.
but the kayak.
and when I started working like with Laura and all, they had those giant
Aluminum?
sea kayaks. No, they had giant sea kayaks. Remember, everyone was in a canoe, but then there was Mike and Laura and RJ and a couple of people in the sea kayaks. And those things are expensive. And they were really heavy. And they were really big. Yeah. So.
And nothing in between.
Nothing in between.
And the tubes don't work either.
Yeah.
That's true. Even when I got my first kayak, there were not many choices. Now, I mean, they're practically disposable. I hate to say, there's a lot of cheapy ones. But anyway, so what would you say are the most or a couple most significant accomplishments of Friends of the Cause?
Well, in terms of benchmarks, in terms of growth along the way, I mean, it's just amazing to see how much you guys have grown. It was at first it was the making the newspapers, getting on the river, and having these giant events and everything else. Then Mike was really instrumental in, and this is a wonderful thing. This is something that I really admire the Friends of the Cause for. All those boat ramps were local. It wasn't the state, it wasn't the federal government, it wasn't anybody like that. Somehow or another, they managed to organize these little towns to put in boat ramps.
It is amazing.
It is amazing.
He worked with all kinds of people and was really, aggressive people. In some ways, like, we need to get this done, and he made it happen.
Yeah, but it's like Stone Soup, people bringing in their
He got people to donate concrete.
I know.
And now there's like 19.
Grassroots.
You said you remember 3, like, official.
Yeah, that was it. Yeah.
It was totally inaccessible unless you own property.
Yeah. And then every one of those bought into it.
And then they took ownership of it.
Yeah. And now we're seeing parks and camping grounds
and across the country there's this, connect city to the river kind of thing going on, which is great.
We connected our rural towns to the river locally without any outside money. So that was a great thing. Then I would say we went through a phase of figuring out how to do grant writing, and I was always very careful about that kind of capacity building because I work with, that's one of the things I do professionally is mentoring different organizations and how to do that. And you have to start slow. And everybody got a little impatient with me, but I thought it was very, very important to build up your credit. You start with something small and then you work your way up. And the more money you get, the more auditing there is, the more reporting there is, and everything else.
That's scary.
Yeah. And so we had quite a good run initially of smaller grants, including EPA grants and federal grants. And, were very, very nice. And I think everybody got more and more comfortable on what that grant management looked like. Now you guys are just fine. There's lots of capacity with it.
But at that time, when the Riverkeeper position was new...
Oh, even before that,
there was no one else in the whole Midwest, right?
Yeah, and we were doing a DIY website,
Lots of... it was all DIY.
That little DIY map that you guys rebuilt. Yes. I mean, that was like the oldest Google map ever.
I know.
It was lots of DIY.
Yes.
Yeah, it was not,
Everything was built from scratch.
Yeah. But built by the people in the organization, not hiring outside consultants.
How about the Riverkeeper position? I mean, that was a big thing.
Yeah, it was a real big thing, and that was kind of like, okay, what do we do? Because one of the things about it is, I think you're one of the few groups that got grandfathered in as a dues-paying community organization spawning of Riverkeeper.
Oh.
Most of the other Riverkeepers, they stand alone.
Oh.
And a lot of them around the country.
Because I don't have a nonprofit attached.
No. Well, or else they develop a nonprofit off of them. But a lot of them fund themselves through litigation.
Mm.
And when Laura and I went to some of the early Waterkeepers Alliance meetings, like we went to Chicago and we went to New York, those were a blast. But she, when we were talking, she's realizing that she was different because she came from the community as a community member.
Yeah.
And most of the U.S. waterkeepers we were talking to were lawyers.
Hmm.
And they had won huge lawsuits, and they were.
And those are all coastal organizations.
A lot of them were. And we talked about that, and I was like, that was not a good model for Kansas.
Mm-mm.
It wasn't a good model for Kansas
Not gonna
at all.
fly here.
No, and so I think one of the things, it's not that Friends of the Caw got a riverkeeper, it's that Friends of the Caw defined the riverkeeper the way they wanted to define it. And the Waterkeepers Alliance went along with it. Because you're not going to find very many that had that kind of history.
I didn't realize that.
Yeah.
That's really cool.
Yeah. You guys are even more unique than you thought.
Yes, and that's why I'm excited to learn all these things that I still don't know. So, what would the river look like had Friends of the Caw not come along?
Well, it wouldn't have as many people on it, which would be a shame.
Still be afraid of it.
It's hard to tell, but the Friends of the Caw moved on a parallel track with the environmental regulations coming in, with generational changes. It started kind of at the perfect time to move forward along with all these other things. And so I think that the Friends of the Caw helped a lot of things along. Some of it might have happened anyway, but maybe not as fast, or maybe not in the way it did. And because the Friends of the Caw has done such a great job of bringing together a lot of different people, it's not just the stereotypical conservation group. You've got people from all parts of the political spectrum. You've got people from all different income levels. You've got people from all different areas of Kansas. So that has brought a lot of people to the river who might not normally have been involved. And with some of the events that you have, like Piers for the Caw and things like that, you're even bringing in people who don't want to be on the river, but who care about the river, So I think you guys have built the community around the river that was really needed to transform its image, but also to reconnect it. Because, when you reconnect to a river, it's not just a physical thing. It's not just like building a nice waterfront walkway or something like that. It's got to be an emotional thing.
Yeah, if people don't experience it, they don't know, they don't have any desire to protect it, or don't know what the problems are. Yeah, so, community building and involvement and education.
And it's also an incubator for democracy.
Let's
and a
hear more about
little
that.
democracy.
Yeah.
It's something that I feel very strongly about is people need to have all different experiences with taking leadership and having impact. I mean, there's nothing better than seeing a local group come together, come up with something that they feel passionate about, that is of benefit to the community, that expands rights, that expands the capacity of the community and brings all community members together, and see that they have an impact. To me, that's the little d democracy at its best.
Yeah, and just as I have heard, I think Dawn say, we want people to know this is yours.
Yeah.
This is your river.
Yeah, and you can have an impact on the world.
Never thought about it.
Yeah.
And especially in a town like this size, community this size, you learn how, your vote really counts, and your voice really,
just like
you can talk to your elected people, and you can make a difference.
And you can feel that, you can have the feeling of being a participant in some kind of something that impacts how things are governed, So you want more boat ramps, you want the water to be cleaner, you want to be able to do recreation, you want people to treat each other well, whatever mix it is. When you see that happening, then it just stokes people's desire to go on and have a voice, And the biggest danger we have right now is people feeling disenfranchised and feeling powerless. That's always the biggest danger. And, you guys have made a lot of people not apathetic.
Good. How great, how lucky we are. And so...
How hard you worked.
True. So what would the river physically be like, or ecologically be like, do you think?
Well,
Do you think another group would have come along, maybe, or not necessarily?
Well, we can look at other rivers in the region. Like the Arkansas River. They're struggling to put together perhaps a waterkeeper. Struggling to put together a group for it. We see a lot of rivers just continue with degradation, especially with dewatering. And, when we're facing climate change, we need to have those strong advocates. So you guys have a 30-year head start on advocating for that river. And so going into the future, the river has a much brighter future.
We've always known that water is important, right? Mm-hmm. But now the issues are really front and center. And, you're right. It's like we started on this a long time ago.
Yeah, you started on it when you should have started on it. Because you
what is the future for the Kansas River? I mean, we know Western forces are trying to take its water, dewater or whatever.
You look at the Ark. I mean, one of the problems we have on the Arkansas River
is drying up,
and because there's way too much groundwater withdrawal. And you guys are branching out to do the wildflower restorations and the bank restorations, and you've got board members who are doing amazing things with larger scale land management issues. I'm thinking of like Heidi Mell and the Nature Conservancy and how they're working with farmers to change farming practices to help with water conservation. So there's like all these
watershed impacts,
all these tentacles you have into the watershed impacts that will help the river going forward. Yeah.
So you're perfect for this question. If a young person came to you from some other place and said, "We want to start a Riverkeeper program here," I mean, what would you advise them? How do you get started?
Yeah, well, what I advise, and I've advised many of my graduate students this way too, is that you need to develop the skills to be able to hear everyone.
Relationships.
Well, and just to hear them, which can be very difficult if their views are really different than yours. But, if you develop those skills, and they are skills, it's not just letting sound hit you, but of teasing apart what people are saying and looking for, are there some gems in it? You might have someone who hates conservation groups and hates rivers and hates kayaks and, hates the entire idea. And then after a while, they might be starting to talk about how their great-grandpa was a cat fisherman on the river, and, the Army Corps doesn't know what they're doing because these levees don't work, and what we used to do back in the day. And then you start pulling out those gems, and you go, okay, well, everyone's got something to contribute. You gotta start there rather than, they voted for somebody else, so I'm not going to listen to them. And so some of my students have actually taken a great deal of sociology, and learned how to do qualitative analysis or whatever to help them learn to listen and learn. In some cases, we've had hysterically funny things where we've looked at watershed groups and we've actually analyzed what they're talking about and found out that the people who hate themselves the most are saying the same thing. You just have to.
You just got to give them in the same room.
Well, no, you can't. You give them in the different rooms that you show them. This is what this person said. And they, yeah, I agree with that. But do you realize that?
Not aligned in every way.
But, to have those skills to be able to bring all those voices together. And I think you guys have just naturally done that. But not every group has, and we've lost a lot of.
Well, we're in Kansas. We have to do things a little differently.
Yeah, and
right?
I think there's some lessons in that the rest of the country could listen to.
So, 50 years from now, what do you hope that the legacy of Friends of the Kai is?
I hope you guys are still around. And right now, I don't see any reason why you wouldn't be. Especially since you're so great at bringing in the next generation. You're a couple generations in now. you're 30 years old, you're hitting middle age, and you've got a good plan for continuously bringing in the next and the next and the next, and mentoring, and there's no reason why it can't continue, especially since it's so local and so vibrant. I tell our students and the young people, it's like, oh my, you're facing so much. So, the older people need to be doing everything they can to support you and prepare you. And we need to have these very robust structures. Friends of the Caw provide an outlet for a lot of younger people who are wrestling with climate change, because the younger people are feeling it a lot more. And if all of a sudden they're doing restorations with Courtney and learning about all the wildflowers, it's healing for them. And that provides them with a good, solid foundation for moving forward. If you remember what's beautiful, you remember what you love, where your passions are, where the people are that are mentoring you, that helps you to move forward. So when you are facing climate change and everything else that we're going to be facing, they'll remember the lessons they learned when they were young from people who started Friends of the Caw from scratch. Because, at least they're starting from something, whereas Friends of the Caw started from nothing.
Yes. Well, that is so beautiful that you bring in the healing aspect. Yeah. Because we all know it's like, well, cleaning up a sandbar of tires is really just another excuse to get out there and paddle in the river and camp overnight, right? But it makes it fun. You're doing important work. You're also connecting people. Healing people, healing You make river. It look better, make it healthier, and have fun while you're doing it. And I think that fun part, the healing part, all that is key. Yeah, we have to not get ourselves into a mindset where we're constantly grieving. Yeah. So then you're paralyzed. Yeah, I'm about to turn 66, and I've been at this for 55 years. Saw the first Earth Day. We had no environmental laws when I was a kid. So starting from nothing and getting something makes you feel like, okay, it's just now the next step is going to be equally as hard, but we can do the next step. We've already cleaned up a lot of stuff. Seeing the challenges are different. But you look at the water quality of the Kansas River over the last 30 years and how much it's improved. That's what I wanted to hear too. Like, how has it improved? Greatly improved. What does it look? What did it look like when you saw it? Well, we had such a terrible problem with nutrient loads, and so much algae and nutrients that was just suffocating everything. That's like cattle runoff and all that, right? It was things like the water treatment plant in Topeka. When they upgraded that, it was huge. Oh, God. But, when you see just a couple of things being improved and the quality going through, getting so much better, then you think, okay, we did that. We can do the next thing. We can do the next hard thing. You need the victories. One of the most amazing things that I've done associated with the Friends of the Caw was when Laura and RJ and I went crazy and spent 10 days on the river. Oh, yeah. The inventory. We went from Junction City to Edwardsville. Days? Yeah, it was 10 days. 10 days. Oh, yeah. And we had to get off the river in Wamego because there was a terrible storm. Oh. So we spent one night off the river. And the city of Wamego helped us carry our kayaks up. And there was an empty store, and they put the kayaks in the storefront. It was really cute. But then we stayed on the river. This was the first trip on the whole Caw, right? The whole thing. And other people may have done it. But, but this was an official Friends of the Caw inventory. And we were so immersed in it. And at the time, there were not very many people on it. It was just the four of you. But four of us beginning, but then there was just three. But we'd go days without seeing any boaters or anything. So it was just really being immersed and camping on those sandbars. And, we laughed afterwards that we had proven that,
your skin doesn't fall off if you bathe in the river for a week.
At least in certain places.
Yes, right. Yeah, that was such an amazing experience, because every day we just wake up and we knew we'd be on the river,
Wow.
and that's all. And back then we had flip phones, right? So we put together a blog, which was really silly because it was before blogs were hardly a thing, and we'd have to scramble up the banks and like walk to somebody's office or to the library or whatever, and we'd log on and we'd write a little paragraph, and then we'd go back down to the river.
You couldn't
and
even share pictures or anything, or. And the science you were doing?
Laura wanted to know what was on the river. Especially back then, it was just so hard to figure out.
You were doing like where there's riparian, or where they.
Yeah, but we were also doing where are there pipes?
Everything.
Where is there anything?
Wires and
we
dumps.
We took pictures of the undersides of all the bridges, and then we actually had people getting a hold of us who were bridge inspectors.
Oh,
yeah!
Send me those shots.
And it was amazing how many people wanted to see just that information, because they didn't have like basic information on, what the bottoms of the bridges looked like, where all the telephone wires.
So you didn't know what was all there until you got there.
Yeah. So we wrote it all down.
Cool.
It was like piles of paper. Because back then, and RJ had this camera that actually geolocated.
Oh,
we
yeah.
had to buy
had GPS.
You can do everything on your phone now.
Yeah.
But not in 2007.
Yeah. That's what, 2007?
I think it was 2007. Uh-huh. You can ask Laura.
And then you did it again, right?
I didn't.
Okay. They did one later.
Yeah, I know that Dawn has done stretches.
Okay.
But
yeah, I think the next time they broke it up into segments.
Yeah, no, that's crazy. Like where you were.
And based on what you did, dig a little deeper. I guess.
And they actually had the basics. It's like we were like, we have no idea, because we didn't have drones back then.
That's so cool. So what was the most surprising thing you learned on that trip?
It just, I think it was just wonderful to see that the vast majority of the river is actually beautiful. We don't have, we have these beautiful sandbars. You come on the sandbars, and they were clean and beautiful and wonderful. And, the impression of the river that a lot of people have is that it's just more physically impacted than it actually is. And I could talk about the channel and everything else, but just day after day after day, finding our sandbar and camping on it and being surrounded by trees, and we'd be just over the levees from a city and not even know it, and you could just get that feeling of you're in nature, so everything melts away.
And, so now there's a lot more recreation on it, but I think you still have those experiences, because it's a lot of work to get out there. You have to have equipment. You still have to know what you're doing.
Some of the stretches, you have to go quite a ways.
That one stretch, we still don't have a boat ramp on between Bellevue and Topeka. Really.
And hopefully we'll just keep getting lots and lots and lots of people on the river.
Yeah. But it's never going to be crowded, right?
I don't think it's ever going to be
It's that kind of river that it's not, comfortable.
You go on some of the national rivers now, and you're waiting in line, bumper to bumper to bumper.
Yeah.
Yeah. But no, this one is bigger and scarier, and
it takes a little
and more beautiful. It takes a little bit more work to love. But you guys do.
Absolutely. Okay. Any last thing that
I'm just so incredibly proud of you guys, and going from the picnic table with Lance and Patty to what you've become now is just phenomenal. It's one of those things where you never expected it to work out so well.
Aw, that's huge. I really appreciate hearing that, and oh my gosh, great stories. Thank you so much. And I want another hour with you or more at some point. So we'll wrap it up there. Thank you, Cynthia. Sure. And please come back and share another time too. So thank you.
Click.